At Second Baptist Church of Ranger, we've been talking about Exodus 34, 6 through 7 for several weeks now. And in the process of these conversations, we've run across some challenges that Bible translators face as they try to move from the Hebrew text of the Old Testament to an English translation that is both accurate and readable. I want us to spend a little more time focusing on those translation challenges in this video. And the way that I want us to do that is by conducting 2 or 3 translation comparisons, you might call them. And that's what we've got here on your screen. More specifically, I've given you 2 prominent Protestant translations. The New International Version, also known as the NIV, and the New Revised Standard Version, also known as the NRSV. Now, the NIV is probably the best-selling modern English translation of the Bible. It still doesn't approach the King James Version and its spin-offs. But as far as modern translations, it is the best-selling or one of the best-selling translations out there. And it's used by a lot of evangelical Protestant Christians. The New Revised Standard Version has also sold well, but not as well as the NIV. It's used by a lot of scholars. It's also used by mainline Protestant lay people and pastors. Presbyterians, Episcopalians, people of that sort. Now, as we look at these 2 translations, I want us to focus on 3 issues. And they're the 3 issues that we really focused on in our preaching on this text. The first, of course, is how you translate those beautifully pesky Hebrew words, chesed and amat. And on this point, the NIV and the NRSV basically agree. The only difference is that the New Revised Standard Version adds a modifier in front of the word love, so that you know this is the Hebrew word chesed and not the Hebrew word ahav. The second translation issue has to do with who is this chesed given to? Who does God show this chesed to? Of course, the NIV translates that thousands, whereas the New Revised Standard says 1,000 generations. So which is it? It's a big difference after all. Well, the Hebrew text actually reads thousands. But there is a similar translation in Exodus 20, or I should say a similar comparison in Exodus 20. The implied comparison in these verses is between thousands, or 1,000 generations, and to the 3rd and 4th generation, down there at the end of verse 7. And you see a similar comparison in Exodus 20. And so the New Revised Standard translators decided that this is an idiom, that this reference to thousands is an idiom. And it is interesting that the NIV, which is usually considered a thought-for-thought translation rather than a word-for-word translation, really sticks closer to the Hebrew wording here than does the New Revised Standard Version. But the truth is that any translation, or almost any translation, when it finds an idiom, is going to try to render that idiom into some kind of English form that will make sense to us. And that's what the New Revised Standard translators did here. And by the way, they're not the only translation that makes this decision, and the NIV is not the only translation that renders the term more, what we would call more literally. I don't like to use that word literal because it actually conjures up a whole bunch of images that aren't really accurate, but we'll use it here. Now, our third translation issue that we want to look at in this comparison, I should say, is those three words that are used for sin in verse 7. Now, you know how the NIV translates it because we've been reading it throughout the sermon series. The NIV translates that series wickedness, rebellion, and sin. The New Revised Standard Version takes a more traditional approach. It renders the series iniquity, transgression, and sin. Now, we don't know, I don't know, and you don't know either of these translation committees. We can't sit down and talk with them and ask them why they decided to do what they did. But it may be that the NIV, which has been more recently updated than the New Revised Standard Version, is taking advantage of some new scholarship on these Hebrew words. That may be what it is. Or it may simply be that the the NIV translators, I should say, looked at the way that these Hebrew words are often rendered and said to themselves, you know what? Nobody knows what that means. Nobody uses the word iniquity or transgression in their daily life. And so we need to find a way to express the same idea in a way that people will actually understand. It's hard to know which of those actually accounts for these differences here. But that may be this idea that readability may be part of what's going on with these translations. Now, I think that makes more sense with the first word in the series, wickedness versus iniquity, than it does with the second word, because the second word, rebellion's a pretty different idea than transgression. So, but regardless, we need to be careful not to presume that we understand what the translators were doing. Sometimes we can infer some things, but we don't want to assume too much, especially if we're assuming negative things about the translation committee. Now here's our second set of translations that I wanted to compare. And here we have a couple of important Roman Catholic translations. The New Jerusalem Bible is probably the most widely read and most widely respected of the Roman Catholic translations. The New American Bible was created by the Catholic Biblical Association, a prestigious guild of Roman Catholic Bible scholars. They're both very good translations, but the New Jerusalem Bible tends to be a little more creative in its approach to translation. Now, the issues that we saw with the first two translations that we compared also emerge here. For example, notice how the New American Bible translates those three words for sin very much like the NIV does. But the New Jerusalem Bible takes a pretty different approach. But what I want us to do is I want us to focus on two additional issues. And the first of those issues is how translators render the divine name. You'll see that the New Jerusalem Bible actually uses the divine name. We pronounce it Yahweh, even though we don't really know for sure how it was pronounced. It's never given vowel points in the Hebrew Old Testament. In Hebrew, your consonants are given letters, your vowels are given points, little marks at the bottom of the word, or sometimes in the middle or at the top of the word, but mostly at the bottom of the word, that tell you what vowel sound you're supposed to use. Well, the problem is the Tetragrammaton, as we call it, the divine name of God, is never vowel pointed. And when it is vowel pointed, it's vowel pointed with the vowel pointings of a different word, Adonai, which means Lord. Okay? But what the New Jerusalem Bible translators decided to do here was to actually use the divine name. That's not what translators normally do. You'll see down there in the New American Bible, they just simply use the word Lord. And very often translations will capitalize the first letter of Lord, and then the other three letters will be in what we call small caps. So they'll be capital letters, but they'll be a little bit smaller than the full capital letter. Okay? So that's one issue. And it's not terribly important in terms of generating meaning. It's just going to be something different that you observe. Now, the next issue is actually a really important translation issue. What do we do with those first two words that define God? They're in verse 6. The New International Version translated them compassionate and gracious. The New Revised Standard Version translated it merciful and gracious. Same thing, really. Okay? But notice what the New Jerusalem Bible does. The New Jerusalem Bible, first of all, it takes what are actually Hebrew adjectives and turns them into nouns, just because of the way that they want to structure the sentence. And there are some grammatical reasons why they do what they do, but we won't get into that here. So they have, Yahweh, Yahweh, God of tenderness and compassion. Now that's interesting, isn't it? If you'll recall, when we talked about that first word, the one that the NIV translates compassionate, we said that there is some linguistic evidence that it could mean tender. And so that's why the New Jerusalem translators have rendered that word tenderness. It's fine. It is a little different, though, than maybe what you're used to reading. It's the second word that is so interesting. Rather than rendering that word gracious or even merciful, they render it compassionate. And the suspicious Protestant in you may be going, oh, there are those Roman Catholics not wanting to talk about grace. Well, there may actually be some truth in that, but not for the reason that you're thinking. Remember, we don't know for sure because we haven't talked to the committee that translated the New Jerusalem Bible. We want to talk to them and ask them why they did what they did. But it may be that since they've turned this from an adjective to a noun, that they don't want to use the word grace here because the word grace carries a lot of theological baggage. People may start reading into that word things that are not actually there. We don't know for sure that that's what they're doing, but it might be. Now look down at the New American Bible. They seem to have no compunctions about grace because they render those words gracious and merciful. Now we've said that second word can mean merciful. It's more often translated gracious. The first word really is rendered more compassionate or merciful than gracious. So it would be interesting to know, why do they do that? Why do they take that translation approach? And it may be simply that they just decided to reverse the order of the English words from the order that we have in Hebrew. So it's really interesting. So you see, now we've got 5 different issues that we've piled on top of each other as we've done these first 2 comparisons. Now I want us to look at two more translations here, and these are prominent Jewish translations. The first is called Tanakh, and it's the official Orthodox Jewish translation of the Old Testament. Okay. The second one is called the Complete Jewish Bible, and it was translated by a single Messianic Jewish scholar. Most translations are done by teams of translators. This one was done by a single person, and that will sometimes give a translation more creativity. It also will sometimes decrease its quality, and we'll see that here in just a moment. Now, the first of these translations, Tanakh, is just a good, solid translation, but it does have an issue that we want to talk about. The Complete Jewish Bible has the same issue, so we want to focus in on that. But we do want to note that there are some other issues, especially with the Complete Jewish Bible translation here. Notice all the garble at the beginning of the Complete Jewish Bible. That's their attempt to deal with the divine name of God. Okay? So you can just kind of ignore that. The real kind of issue that you want to deal with here is, notice how they render chesed and amat. They render them grace and truth. Now, amat does not really mean truth so much as it means truthfulness. And chesed does not mean grace. That's grace is a loaded word theologically, and really I don't think that it works with chesed. I don't think that that's a good translation. But it would be interesting to talk to the translator and find out why he took that approach. And of course, each of these translations takes a different approach to those three words for sin we talked about. But I want to talk about one specific issue with respect to these translations. And it's the question of how God's forgiveness relates to his punishment. How does God's habit of forgiving relate to God's habit of punishment? Because we tend to think of those two things as opposites. But actually, the first four translations we looked at left that issue unresolved, and I would argue that's how the Hebrew leaves it. But these two translations are unwilling to do that. Tanakh translates that last clause so as to say that God's forgiveness does not result in the end of all punishment. So what it does is it seems to be saying that forgiveness results in a partial remission of punishment, but not in the total remission of punishment. The Complete Jewish Bible takes a different approach. It strongly implies that the issue here is not punishment at all. It is simply the natural consequences of sin. Now, as we observed in our sermon on forgiveness and punishment, that's really good sociology. And it's pretty good theology. Look at Romans chapter 6, for example. But it may not be good translation. It does seem, at least from the other translations that we've looked at here, that God is talking about punishment. And it also seems that God is talking about punishment without any real sort of reference that there might be a remission of part of it. Still, these translations are valuable. Why? Because they bring to light a question that we might not have asked if we hadn't run across these translations. That is, the question of the relationship between forgiveness and punishment. So I hope that this discussion has been enlightening, and I hope that it encourages you to really dig into Scripture, and to, when you run across a difficult text or an important text, or a text that has a really detailed argument, read multiple translations. See how they view the text from different perspectives. And see what God may want to use those different translations to communicate to you as a person or to your congregation.